Uh, Good morning, everyone. I know it's late in the evening in US, so good evening to our speaker. And thank you, everyone, for joining an hour early. But because of time zone issues, we wanted to do this 1 hour early to get Michael to come join us. So today's session is on decoding the political communication in the Af-Pak region. Before I hand it over to the moderator for this session, my co-founder, co-host Shreyas Deshmukh, I will just give you a brief about us. So Asian Pathfinders was started earlier this year. We hold these regular sessions, which we call fireside chats and dialogues. Our fireside chats is what we hold on a Saturday in the morning at 11 or 10. Uh, and we have dialogues which are held every alternate Thursdays. These are panel discussions. We just had one this week, so the next is going to be about 2 weeks later. And our aim is to be this knowledge sharing platform where we can bring different voices, not just in our own field, right? Interdisciplinary voices, to have these constructive dialogues to give us a better understanding of the issues around our self, right? Things like politics, security, everything, right? Cyber security, everything under the sun. So that's us. And so just a basic community guidelines. Please respect the views of others. We come from very different backgrounds, different walks of life, and we all have our views, and we're entitled to it, and so are others. So please respect that. And respect intellectual property. Our speakers are experts in their field. They work really, really hard on their research. So please attribute to them anything that they say here. And again, just stick to parliamentary language. And this has come to our notice, so I want to highlight it. Please do not put any promotional content here, which is definitely not relevant to these sessions, right? And if you want to, please reach out to us and let us know. And apologies in advance if any one of you received in the past few sessions any promotional content which is not ours. We're really sorry about that. And so we have Dr. Manpreet Sethi, who is the Senior Fellow and Head of Nuclear Security Program at Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, and she'll be speaking on the state of the global nuclear order. And for the ones who do not know, Dr. Sethi is very well known in this field of nuclear security and disarmament in the wider research community. So I think this is a very interesting session. She's been doing this research for nearly 20 years now. So yeah. So how do you reach out to us? We are on social media. Please reach out if you have any sessions that you want to hold yourself. Please reach out to us with the topic, the idea. Also, if you have anyone you want to recommend to us as a speaker, please write to us. We'll be happy to consider. So, and today's session, I think it's a pleasure to introduce your co-founder. Not that I am sorry about that. That you get that kind of an opportunity. So Shreyas Deshmukh, a lot of you know as the silent co-founder who doesn't speak much, but yeah, Shreyas is an expert on the Af-Pak region. Just like our speaker, he's been monitoring that region for a very long time. He is the research associate at Delhi Policy Group. On weekends, he's the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, but on weekdays, he's a research associate at the think tank in Delhi. Previous to that, he's worked as a geopolitical analyst at MitKat Advisory Services. He's worked for Center for Land Warfare Studies, which is another think tank in Delhi. And Shreyas holds a master's from University of Pune in Defense and Strategic Studies. So over to you, Shreyas.
Thank you, Pallavi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Loud and clear. Thank you. Thank you so much for a kind introduction. And thank you, Michael, for joining us today. And as a student of area study focusing on Afghanistan and Pakistan, I do follow your work closely as it is one of the credible source and analysis available on the subject. After following the region for almost 5 years, I'm still struggling to understand topic, which is also a subject of today's discussion. How does one decode political communication in the Af-Pak region? I think you may agree with me about this dilemma. That when I say struggling, it is about connecting the dots at the tactical level, which eventually leads to understanding the strategic goals of the nation states involved in the Af-Pak region. At a strategic level, it seems everyone knows everything about the regional dynamics. For example, India-Pakistan rivalry in Afghanistan or Iran-Saudi competition, Chinese interest in the Afghan minerals and link to the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia's Eurasian dream, desires for access to the warm waters of Arabian Sea, and the establishing North-South corridor in the region. However, the more we try to understand these dynamics, more gray areas appear while evaluating the developments at tactical level. Taliban-Iran relations. So currently we say they are tactical, but we don't know will they develop into the strategic arena. The idea of complete US withdrawal from Afghanistan, once no one considered the possibility of it. US-Russia joint statements on Afghan peace process. Is it based on cooperation? I don't know. Reports of China's military bases in Badakhshan area. Pakistan's attempt to hardening the border with Afghanistan in order for the Durand line to be considered as an international border. How will the Afghan government and the Taliban react to this development when they do not accept the Durand line in the future? So beside these ground realities, we have seen statements hinting towards possible future equations of multilateral cooperations emerging in this area. For an example, brewing geoeconomic competition to secure economic interest post-Afghan peace deal, obviously, and strategic trade routes in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. Recently, the core of discussion in the held C5+1 meeting between the US Secretary of State and the foreign ministers of the 5 Central Asian states was Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, that is TIFA. And while progress of Belt and Road Initiative projects were discussed in the inaugural foreign ministers meeting between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his Central Asian counterparts in July. Later, while traveling to Doha in September, Secretary Pompeo said in his remarks that there are no guarantees in Afghanistan, so uncertainty still persists. It is not known what was discussed during the meetings between Pakistan Chief of Army Staff and Commander of US Central Command, Head of Operations Freedom Sentinel, and Operation Resolute Support Mission. So there are multiple meetings keep happening in last few months and before that. Recently, the dilemma affirmed by the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, when he said, if we stay, we risk continued fighting and an even longer term engagement. If we leave, we risk Afghanistan once again becoming a safe haven for international terrorists and the loss of the gains made with such sacrifices. The outcome of visit by Abdullah to India, Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, and other countries, what he's trying to communicate with these countries during those trips. I'm sorry. And what and to whom Taliban is trying to communicate and with increased level of violence post the February peace agreement. And what does exactly the phrases like Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and Afghan-controlled peace process means? Because there could be many meanings of it, and we do, as I said, at the strategic level, we know the most of the people knows everything what is happening and the rivalries what are going on. But tactical level, we don't know what does this mean. And I think we can try to find the answers to these questions by carefully analyzing the means or tools of communication between the various players in the region, which could be violence, diplomacy, economic engagements, or for that matter, military movements. Through this, we can work to find answers regarding the interest of the different countries, which will determine the future of Af-Pak region. So for this, I will hand it over to Michael to help us decode what the political communication in the region signals. But before that, a little bit about Michael. Actually, there is more about it. He worked extensively on this region. Michael is the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center based in Washington, D.C., where he is responsible for research, programming, and publication on the region. His main expertise are Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, and US relations with each of them. He writes monthly columns for Foreign Policy South Asia channel and monthly Commentaries for War on the Rocks, which is a very well-known portal for the analysis on geopolitical issues. He also contributes regular pieces to the Wall Street Journal, think tank blogs, and also publish op-eds and commentaries in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Politico, and list goes long. He has also produced a number of longer publications on South Asia, including edited volumes, Pakistan's Interminable Energy Crisis, Is There Any Way Out? And the next one is Pakistan's runway urbanization, What Can Be Done? Michael received his MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and Bachelor of Arts from the American University. I think that is more than enough to, and he extend, as I earlier said, I do follow his works since long time. So I think I'm very eager to know his views on this subject. Over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the kind introduction, perhaps too kind. Thank you. And I also wanted to thank Asian Pathfinders for inviting me. So I thank Pallavi and her colleagues and you, Shreyas, for bringing me on board. I think that your organization is a great idea. It's a great thing, and I wish it all the best. So yeah, so in this topic of decoding political communication in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, as you noted in your introduction, it's very complex. And you said that you've been studying it and still trying to figure it out. I've been studying for a long time myself, and I'm still trying to figure things out. So we could go in so many different directions in terms of this conversation on this topic. But what I thought I would do to kick off the discussion is just offer some thoughts on two broad points, and then happy to take things wherever you'd like in the discussion. The first point I'll opine on for a bit is the current state of the Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship. And the other point I'll get into is the regional dimension of the intra-Afghan dialogue. So first of all, in terms of the Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship, we have two states, two nations here that share many historic, linguistic, ethnic, cultural links, among other things. But they have a very highly volatile relationship, as you know. Security tensions have been quite rife for a number of years. Each side accuses the other of sponsoring violent actors on their soil that target the other side. Afghanistan, of course, has indicated that Pakistan shelters the Taliban, which we know this has been the case for many years. Pakistan, for its part, claims that Afghanistan, with help from India, is sheltering anti-Pakistan groups like the Pakistani Taliban, among others. And you've got a long-standing border dispute, which I think is much more fundamental and structural and pathological in terms of the long-standing divides between the two countries. There is an unresolved border. Afghanistan does not recognize the Durand Line. And this tends to exacerbate Pakistani fears about this notion of Afghanistan trying to unite Pashtuns on both sides of the border. And this contributes as well to deep state-led discrimination against the Pashtun community in Pakistan. Pashtuns comprise the second largest ethnic group in Pakistan after Punjabis. And of course, also the fact that most members of the Pakistani Taliban, which is probably the most deadly terrorist organization that has ever existed in Pakistan, most members of the Pakistani Taliban are Pashtuns as well. And this just pours more fuel on the fire, so to speak. There are also large numbers of Afghan refugees in Pakistan. They've been there for a number of years. Most of them are Pashtuns, and they suffer tremendous levels of discrimination, which sometimes turns violent. Pakistanis, including the state, oftentimes blame these Afghan refugees in Pakistan for being involved in the drug trade and for being involved in terrorism. But it's not just Afghan origin Pashtuns in Pakistan that suffer from discrimination. Pakistani Pashtuns do as well, and especially with some of them having formed a recent new movement, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, the PTM, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which calls for greater rights for Pashtuns, and it is witheringly critical of the Pakistani military. The Pakistani state hates the PTM, not just because it's so harshly critical of the Pakistani state, but because of this long-standing Pakistani fear of Pashtun separatism, the fear that the PTM may kindle nationalistic or even separatist sentiments and try to unite Pashtuns on both sides of the Durand line. And the fact that the PTM tends to get very emphatic public endorsements of Ashraf Ghani, among other very senior Afghan Pashtun leaders, this is something that causes even more problems for the PTM and makes it even more maligned in Pakistan than it already is. So the bottom line is that there are lots of tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan that run quite deep. And the diplomatic relationship is always turbulent. And there have been periods of high-level engagement and diplomacy between the two sides to promote shared interests. And oftentimes the agenda for these types of discussions focuses on issues like promoting better joint border management. And there are frequent high-level visits between the two sides. Pakistani prime ministers and army chiefs, for that matter, have frequently gone to Kabul, whereas Afghan presidents and other senior officials have oftentimes visited Pakistan. And invariably, when you have these high-level visits, they frequently yield joint statements with very positive rhetoric, with pledges to work together. But ultimately, these things don't really last. The momentum isn't sustained that long. And that's because of the underlying mistrust and tensions that I described earlier. Now, just a few weeks back, as you all know, Imran Khan, the Pakistani prime minister, went to Afghanistan. And I think that it was a success from a public relations standpoint. A lot of smiles, a lot of handshakes between him and the various Afghan officials that he met there. And you even had Imran Khan posing for photos while holding a cricket bat with Amrullah Saleh, who is the first vice president of Afghanistan and one of the biggest, most critical hawks when it comes to Pakistan. He was posing, smiling with Imran Khan. And I think that from a diplomatic perspective, Khan's visit was successful as well, and that it resulted in new pledges of cooperation in a variety of spaces, including pledges to resume a stalled intelligence collaboration initiative that had first been launched several years earlier. Now, will the momentum from Khan's visit to Afghanistan be sustained, and will Afghanistan-Pakistan relations enjoy a pleasant spell? I don't know, not necessarily, but I think we need to hope it does, because the stakes are really high right now. I think that indeed any increase in cooperation, any new confidence building measures are critical right now, given that Pakistan is likely to play some type of facilitating role in the current peace and reconciliation process. And that's because of the leverage that it wields over the Taliban. And if it's true that Pakistan will continue to hang around an intra-Afghan dialogue where the Afghan government is one of the parties, then I think you really would want to have better, smoother Pakistan-Afghanistan relations. I think at the very least, if you're looking for some type of realistic and impactful outcome for Afghanistan-Pakistan diplomacy these days, I think what we can hope for is some type of new agreement, perhaps, to govern or to better govern border transit. I mean, so many people pass through the border. Many Afghans go to Pakistan to work, to see family, to get medical attention, and so on. And yet there are often bottlenecks, barriers, and also oftentimes just poorly implemented processes. To bring the human element to the fore here. Not long ago, a few weeks ago, about I think 11 Afghan women were trampled to death while waiting in a soccer field, waiting to get visas so that they could leave the country. I presume many of them to go to Pakistan. This is clearly not good. So I think that some type of facilitative agreement on cross-border movement would be great. And again, any increase in trust between the two sides is a good thing, given the reality of this intra-Afghan dialogue. And I can't overstate enough that the sentiments are very fraught. I mean, as I said before, there are a lot of links between the two sides that go back many years. I mean, you have so many Afghans that go into Pakistan all the time, but public perceptions of the other are very harsh. Pakistanis are deeply mistrusted in Afghanistan. And in Pakistan, there's a lot of discrimination toward Afghans, a lot of unhappiness toward Afghans. And quite frankly, from my visits to Pakistan specifically, sometimes the nasty things that I heard said by people, including very well-educated people, about Afghans are more withering and more harsh than what they say about Indians, which is saying something. But at any rate, any increased in trust between these two sides is important now, given the reality of this intra-Afghan dialogue going on right now. And during one of his recent visits to the region, Zalman Khalilzad, of course, the U.S. Special Envoy on Afghan Reconciliation, he had actually publicly called for some type of agreement between Afghanistan and Pakistan. He didn't really dwell on it, he didn't go into detail, but I think that for him, the idea was what I had mentioned before, that any type of better cooperation between these two countries would be a good thing for the peace process, which is very fragile to start with, of course. So this is a session on political communication in the Af-Pak region. So I thought that, so I've said something about Afghanistan-Pakistan diplomacy. I'll just say a few words about what the regional story is, what other regional players are doing on the diplomatic front in the region, and specifically as it applies to the intra-Afghan dialogue and what it means. So I think before in your introduction, you mentioned that we hear this phrase about an Afghan-owned, Afghan-led peace process. And it's true, we hear it all the time. I would argue that we hear those phrases so often that they've practically become cliche. You hear them all the time. But despite that, it's quite clear that that's not true. This is not going to be an Afghan-owned and Afghan-led peace process. Regional players, external actors will play key roles too. And this has already been happening for a number of months. A number of regional actors have been hosting meetings between the various stakeholders in Afghanistan, including the Taliban, and urging the various sides to keep talking. And I think that it's quite simple, but bears noting at any rate, Afghanistan's neighbors are integral to the peace process because unlike geographically distant actors like the US, they have a direct stake in the outcome. Regional players may take different approaches to Afghanistan, which they do, but I would argue, some would disagree with me, but I would argue that just about every neighbor of Afghanistan's gains from a more stable, peaceful neighbor. On the whole, the region would benefit in a big way from successful peace talks. If you have more stability, that would reduce conflict spillover effects, such as refugee flows and drug trafficking, which are problematic for neighboring states. In Pakistan, as I mentioned before, hosts a large number of Afghan refugees. In fact, they host more than any other country. But Iran, which also borders Afghanistan, hosts the second largest number of Afghan refugees. But in recent years, both have sought to repatriate many of them, mainly because of economic distress and other factors. Afghan poppy production helps fund the Taliban insurgency. This also brings a lot of Afghanistan-sourced narcotics to India, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, all nations struggling with opioid and heroin epidemics. And also, the ending war with the Taliban would theoretically enable Afghan security forces to focus more on combating ISIS, the most potent militant group in Afghanistan after the Taliban, and a group that all regional actors regard as a major threat, every one of them. And also, a more peaceful Afghanistan, by ushering in greater security, would unlock opportunities for regional trade, investment, connectivity. China, of course, could expand its BRI into Afghanistan. And then these slow-moving infrastructure projects like the TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, could enjoy new momentum. India could increase cooperation with Iran on infrastructure development from the port of Chabahar in Iran into Afghanistan. So this is all to say that the countries flanking the Afghanistan-Pakistan region have a strong incentive to do what they can to help advance a fledgling, fragile peace process. Now, certainly, Pakistan may well, or I would argue, certainly would derive a strategic benefit from continued war because given the added strength that would accrue to the Taliban, a key Pakistani ally under those circumstances. But I would argue that Pakistan actually gains more from the current peace process because If the peace process is successful, it would give Pakistan what it's always wanted, a friendly government in Kabul with a prominent Taliban role, because if the peace process is successful, it would presumably result in a political settlement in which the Taliban holds a significant degree of power, which of course would be problematic for some other countries in the region, particularly India, which I'll get to in a second, but it's be a good thing for Pakistan. And I would argue as well that the worst case scenario of continued war in Afghanistan, where the Taliban actually is able to start seizing cities and eventually seizing power and reinstituting the same awful theocratic regime that it imposed in the 90s, under that worst case scenario, that could actually disadvantage Pakistan by effectively emboldening Islamist extremists in Pakistan and inspiring them to carry out attacks on the Pakistani state and maybe trying to launch a whole new anti-state terror campaign, much like what the Pakistani Taliban did some years back. So I think that of all the regional actors, India has the most reason to be concerned about the peace process for good reason. As I suggested before, it could produce a political settlement that allocates power to the Taliban, which is a Pakistan-allied group that's been blamed for a number of attacks on Indian targets in Afghanistan over the years. And of course, obviously, if you have the Taliban in a position of power in Afghanistan, that would ensure continued Pakistani influence in Afghanistan. But a peace deal would dramatically reduce security threats to India and Afghanistan. It would better enable New Delhi to pursue development projects and broader relations in a country where it already has provided $3 billion in assistance since 2001 and has a strategic partnership agreement in place with Kabul. And it's interesting that some strategic thinkers in India in recent months have called on India to start engaging with the Taliban, which I should say has signaled its willingness to support infrastructure projects with an Indian footprint. And a few years ago, 2 retired Indian diplomats attended a conference in Moscow that featured Taliban representatives. And in February of this year, when you had the signing ceremony in Doha for the US-Taliban deal, India's ambassador to Qatar was there. It was the first time in more than 20 years that an Indian official attended an event in person with a member of the Taliban. So bottom line is regional actors, I would argue, have a strong incentive to help move the needle forward on the peace process. Regional diplomacy that prods the Afghan state and the Taliban to keep talking is always useful, as are efforts to push the Taliban to agree to concessions, such as reducing violence, that would deliver major boosts to talks. You could argue that Afghanistan's immediate neighbors could also realistically try to, focusing on this more broadly, pursue new border management agreements with Kabul. I think this would all help build trust, reduce border instability, and enable Afghan officials to focus more fully on peace talks. But here comes the Debbie Downer moment, sort of the rain on the parade moment of this potential optimism. We always have to be cautious about being optimistic in an Afghanistan context. I would argue that these regional efforts certainly are helpful, but they can only go so far. I would argue that Afghanistan's neighbors can use diplomacy and pressure, but their leverage is limited. Pakistan wields more leverage over the Taliban than any other regional actor, owing to the sanctuary that it's long provided to the Taliban leadership. But clearly that leverage has its limits because, Islamabad clearly has not convinced the insurgents to agree to a violence reduction plan, much less a ceasefire, even though it's been under a lot of pressure from the US and others to do this for a number of months. It hasn't worked. India, by contrast, probably has more leverage over Kabul than any other regional player due to its very close ties. But India's role in the peace process has been quite hands-off, mainly because of Pakistan's presence in it. So I think this brings us to a rather sobering coda, and that is that Afghanistan's neighbors may share the goal, broadly speaking, of peace and stability in Afghanistan, but they have a very limited ability to advance that goal, despite the diplomacy and other engagements that they have undertaken with Kabul and the Taliban. And quite frankly, I think that for all this talk about regional solutions to Afghanistan and the regional picture and the Afghan peace process. You know, you could have every neighbor of Afghanistan's, every regional player out there, you could have them all trying to push the two sides to carry out a peace process. You could have them all trying to convince the Taliban to talk peace, but it's the Taliban that's the key factor at the end of the day. I would argue that the Taliban has the upper hand. It has had the upper hand in this peace and reconciliation process from the start. It's gotten everything that it's wanted. Everything has happened on its terms. It got its bilateral negotiations with the US without Afghanistan present, which it had wanted for a long time. It got the troop withdrawal deal with the US that it wanted, and now it got all these Taliban prisoners released that it had insisted on, which was a part of the US Taliban deal that Kabul had not been privy to. So Kabul was essentially in a position where it had to whittle down or fritter away its all these potential bargaining chips by releasing all these Taliban prisoners. And now the Taliban got its direct talks with the Afghan government without having to agree to a ceasefire in order for them to start. And the Taliban knows that the US is on its way out. Taliban knows that it can simply wait out the US and then if it wanted to, just start going fully focusing on the battlefield in a war that it believes that it's winning. So that means that Taliban doesn't have to listen to any of these regional actors if it doesn't want to, including Pakistan. It can just say, that's fine. You could try to get us to make concessions given to demands, that's fine, but we'll do things on our own terms. So bottom line is that I don't think we should overstate this notion of, you know, regional influence in the broader peace process. So, and there, look forward to questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that enlightening and covering the whole region. Actually, you mentioned about the incentives for the regional actors because of the peace process, but you also mentioned about there is a very limited ability these regional actors have to communicate with each other. Further, it is reducing also that ability. So we have regional actors and we have extra regional actors over here. For an example, Belgium and Germany is reducing their troops levels in Afghanistan recently. US is out, maybe like if Trump continued to push for the further withdrawal, they may have just 2,000 forces by the end of January. So we have two distinct nature of the two different states here. One is the regional actors, one is the extra regional actors. So at the same time, we see the different interests of these states. Could you please just give a little bit more thought about how the NATO will react further on these developments and the European countries and Nordic countries, because their interests are also very important. It's just related to the terrorism issue or the security issue, or further they have geopolitical interests in this region. Because as I said in my introduction that a few years back, nobody thought that US will completely withdraw from Afghanistan. Everybody was saying that even at the end of the peace process or end of the Afghan war, US will continue to maintain some small number of troops over there, and the base maybe in Bagram or maybe in Herat somewhere. So I don't know how it will fall out, but your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a great question. I mean, at this point, the NATO mission, it's true, but the NATO troop posture is much more modest than it used to be, in line with the US troop posture. And I think that the NATO countries other than the US will basically take the US's lead. So, you know, if President President-elect Biden decides to pull all remaining troops, then I'm sure you'll see a similar thing with those NATO countries that still have troops in Afghanistan. But at this point, you know, I think that NATO is in lockstep, that they're fully behind the NATO countries are fully behind the peace process. And not just NATO, but the EU, a number of key EU countries, including Germany, especially Germany, have been playing very significant roles in convening track twos and these dialogues in which they convene key stakeholders from Afghanistan and Europe, and sometimes even figures close to the Taliban to have discussions, typically privately, off the record, that type of thing. So they've played that role that some of the regional actors, like the Chinese and the Russians, are playing, of just getting as many people to talk as possible. But it is interesting that the EU, the main EU rep in Afghanistan, Roland Kobe, I think is his name, he's sort of been different in that he's been much more harsh on the Taliban in his public messaging, being much more critical of the Taliban after, you know, the latest atrocity that it carries out. Not quite as polite and diplomatic as Khalilzad is, so it's interesting. But at any rate, in terms of the operational posture, as I had said, I think that whatever the US decides to do with its remaining troops, the rest of the NATO countries will follow accordingly. So that comes to the question of what can we expect from President-elect Biden in Afghanistan. You know, in a nutshell, he's actually similar mind to Trump. Biden is not a big fan of large extended US military commitments in Afghanistan or anywhere else. When Biden was vice president, he was a vocal opponent of President Obama's troop surge. Biden has always favored a small counterterrorism focused force, and that will continue to be the case with him now. I think he or anyone close to him has not really said much about what he intends to do in Afghanistan. What we have heard is that he will support a, quote, responsible withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think is code for a withdrawal that would be more conditions-based. So I think that we could see the Biden administration, more so than the Trump administration, try to essentially threaten to the Taliban that the US would not pull any more troops out of Afghanistan until the Taliban has started reducing violence, and there are clear signs of that. I also imagine that Biden would very strictly interpret the US Taliban agreement, which essentially says that all US troops will leave Afghanistan by the spring of 2021 if the Taliban has reduced cooperation or has ended cooperation with Al-Qaeda. It hasn't done that yet. I'm not sure it will. Given that Biden likes to look at Afghanistan through a counterterrorism lens, I imagine that he would be perfectly happy to keep the remaining 2,500 troops that'll be in Afghanistan when he takes office. He'll be comfortable keeping them there, or at least most of them there, to essentially serve a counterterrorism purpose, if the Taliban continues to show no indications that it's ended ties with Al-Qaeda. I mean, the administration will be able to make that argument that it's under no obligation to pull those remaining troops so long as the Taliban continues to cooperate with Al-Qaeda. So, but that's what it'll come down to. At the end of the day, this administration will be less interested in the pace of the peace process and much more interested in maintaining some type of counterterrorism capacity.
That's most interesting, actually. But we left out two countries, actually. One is Russia. Post February agreement, US and Russia came out with two joint statements and on the cooperation on Afghan peace process. We don't know what is happening vis-a-vis the Russian peace process, which was Russia earlier very aggressive about the peace process, calling the Afghan or Taliban interlocutors to Moscow, discussing with them, other regional actors. Even India participated once in the peace process, unofficially, actually. Where does Russia stand on this peace process? Because we see the cooperation, those two joint statements, but we don't know what exactly the Russian interest. The second one is China. Take one is also asking this question, that where does China also stand? Because China is engaging with the Taliban since 2013. I think the first visit by the Taliban delegation to Beijing, and prior to that, their investments in mining sector and etc. they're stalled and nothing is happening on that front. But China has started politically engaging with the Taliban and Afghan politicians. It's almost 2013. And later in 2014, they announced CPEC and OBOR and all that come later. So your views on that, China and Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great. And I think that you could also throw Iran into that mix too, right? America's top three rivals, all neighbors of Afghanistan, all seeing eye to eye, for the most part, on what they want to see in Afghanistan. They all support the peace process, I think. They all are very worried about ISIS, and they all don't get along with the United States. So what does this all mean? It's hard to say. I mean, China, I think, has been pretty hands off. I mean, indeed, as you noted, there has been some efforts on the part of the Chinese to get involved in the diplomatic aspects of the peace and reconciliation process. But I think that China is staying fairly quiet. It's playing a very subtle role. China has actually had to hold back in Afghanistan. It's had to really put on hold much of its investment plans in Afghanistan in recent years as the war has gotten out of control. It wants to be able to bring BRI there, but it really can't until there's a peace process. China, so far as I know, does not have any type of security presence in Afghanistan. And I know there have been reports of manifestations of Chinese security assistance, even a Chinese fort being built in eastern Afghanistan. I don't think that's the case. I know that China worries about ETIM, about this terror group mainly comprised of Uyghur militants, but I think it wildly overstates the threat posed by that group, which just has a few hundred fighters. And I think the U.S. government recently undesignated it as a terrorist organization. I think China uses that group as a pretext for the horrendous things that it does to the Uyghur community. So I think China will try to do what it can in terms of where it can be helpful diplomatically, with quietly, subtly behind the scenes, encouraging all key stakeholders to move forward. But now that the formal talks have begun, I don't think there's as much of a need for it to play the role of hosting these informal meetings between the Taliban and others. Russia, I see in a similar light. I think that Russia, of course, is a very interesting case, right? Given the history that you had the Soviet Union occupy Afghanistan, and then it withdrew, and it was a very traumatic period in Soviet history, and then in Russian history as well. And yet, in recent years, Russia has tried to bring back its footprint into Afghanistan, and this is not recent. This is from well before the peace process began. Over the last few years, Russia's been trying to reach out not only to Kabul, but to a number of political stakeholders, to a number of parliamentarians in the country. And I think Russia it's a regional power, and it wants to expand its influence in the broader region. So I think, like China, it would want to be helpful where it can, it would like to be helpful where it can on diplomatic levels with advancing the peace process. But I think it's going to hold back. I do not think there's reason to believe the reports from the New York Times some time ago that Russia was paying bounties to Taliban-allied militants to go after the U.S. I mean, I will say that Russia has done some terrible things, so you can't just say it didn't happen. But the time frame for when that was alleged to have happened was at a moment when the Taliban was actually negotiating with the U.S. So, for the Taliban to be taking money from the Russians and using it to go after the U.S. at the very time it was negotiating with them seems a bit hard to believe. And a number of U.S. military officials have subsequently said that they themselves, given the intelligence they've seen, don't have reason to think that the reports are true. Now, Iran is an interesting case, just because I think we always have to look at Iran's situation, its policies in Afghanistan from the lens of the U.S.-Iran relationship. There's always more of a chance for Iran engaging in policies detrimental to U.S. interests and detrimental to stability in Afghanistan when the U.S.-Iran relationship is in a bad place, which it has been, of course, over the last few years, particularly in the Trump era. And we always hear that Iran tries to retaliate against the U.S. and U.S. interests through working with proxies around the broader region. And Iran has provided episodic levels of small arms support to the Taliban in recent years in an effort to essentially strengthen America's rival in Afghanistan. But that's not as much of a threat now that the Taliban theoretically is not attacking U.S. forces anymore. So it's not like Tehran would have an incentive to funnel all these arms to the Taliban to go after the U.S. Now, There are other actors that Iran could try to liaise with. I mean, you have several different Shia militias in both Afghanistan and Pakistan that have been exploited, leveraged by Iran in recent years to help serve its interests, including by fighting against ISIS in Syria. So, you know, Iran theoretically could try to rejuvenate those groups to target US forces in Afghanistan. But in terms of the peace process, again, I think Iran supports it. Iran would much prefer that Afghanistan not be at war. It really worries about ISIS, so it would love for the Afghan security forces to be in this position to more fully focus on that threat. But you know, to get to the question about Iran as it was posed, certainly, I think that if the U.S.-Iran relationship were to improve even a bit, if the Biden administration were to be able to get back into the nuclear deal with Iran, which is a pretty big if, it could be difficult, I think that certainly that would lower the temperatures between the U.S. and Iran, and that would make Iran clearly have less incentive to try to hit out or target U.S. troops in Afghanistan through working with proxies. So certainly, I think that it would be a net benefit, a clear benefit to Afghanistan, to the peace process, if there were a better relationship between the U.S. and Iran.
Certainly. We'll just a little bit head towards more west, and we could think of the role of Doha in this peace process, because it is the most important role Qatar is playing. And we see, as you see the Shravan's question, you just answered about the role of Iran and stability in Afghanistan. But since last few years, maybe I think since 2015, or later, the blockade of Qatar by the Gulf countries, we have seen the new group have emerged with Qatar, Turkey, and plus Iran in the region. And to opposite that, we have Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries. But recently, I think I have seen some reports that the UAE and Saudi Arabia is having some issues vis-a-vis the oil production and etc. But that keeping aside, but we see these two groupings who are also engaged in Afghan peace process. So how does Saudi, which is traditional investor, I would say, in Afghanistan, particularly to dominate the ideological front, whereas Turkey is right now currently spending more money into this sector, and also Qatar is very important actor. So how this rivalry goes here in this conflict?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I do think that both camps in this rivalry are generally like-minded about what they want for Afghanistan. Indeed, I do think that Doha is going to try to leverage this prominence that it plays in the peace process by hosting it. And you know, certainly, as I understand it, a number of senior Taliban officials have essentially relocated to Doha. That, you know, basically, it's you've got a Doha Shura now instead of a Quetta Shura, and that's significant. It gives Doha leverage. But you know, what that means for the broader geopolitical rivalry and all that, it's hard to say. I'm not sure I would overstate the impact that regional rivalry could have on the peace process, just because, you know, this is a case where both sides of the rivalry see eye to eye, the Saudis and the Iranians for sure. That's true. I mean, the Saudis their role has been a bit problematic on a number of levels because of the ideological influence of Wahhabism and the impact and the influence on the ideology of the Taliban and the funding that the Saudis, as I understand it, have, at least in the past, provided to the Taliban. That's problematic. But it's interesting, unless I'm missing something, the Saudis seem to have been fairly quiet during this whole peace process. You know, I don't know of them taking on a significant role, and maybe the fact that you have Qatar hosting it could be a reason why. But certainly it does seem like Iran has been a bit more visible than Saudi Arabia, which is interesting, given that Iran is the Shia state that you know, has had a lot of trouble with the Taliban over the last 20 years. So anyway, it's I don't know. I wouldn't overstate the impact. Certainly, I don't think that there could be a negative impact on the peace process from this regional rivalry. At least now. I mean, everything gets more complicated if the peace process fails and there's no more peace process and Afghanistan is falling apart. Then all bets are off, and everything would get worse. But at this point in time, at least, I don't think that regional rivalry has too much of a negative impact on the peace process.
This brings back me to the question of ideology, because this region, the Middle East or West Asia, what we call here, has seen ISIS from the close quarters and its impact in the region, and it's still there in Syria. Or also recently there were reports about in Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, some of the ISIS factors have been other actors, or the maybe state or non-state actors. There is a question from Shravan about the ISIS continuing to play a violent spoiler to bring any peace in Afghanistan. So we don't see much, what I can say, a link between ISIS in Afghanistan or ISIS in Iraq, and because it is it seems on front two distinct entities, but ideologically they are same though, but they don't have any as such relations, because ISIS, the entity emerged in Afghanistan, I think in 2014 first time, 2015, but later it continued to stay there in particular parts of like Badakhshan and some part of the Nimrod and some Loya Paktika region. So how do you see ISIS is continue to be there in Afghanistan in the future and its role?
Yeah, so ISIS is very much a problem. As I said before, it's clearly the second most potent group in Afghanistan, and probably, you know, now that ISIS Central has lost its caliphate in Syria and Iraq, I think that Afghanistan is one of the biggest fronts for ISIS at this point in time. And, you know, it's, I mean, a few comments on this front. On one hand, you know, ISIS is constrained in Afghanistan because it doesn't have any logical partners. Because keep in mind, I mean, ISIS, it is a foreign organization in Afghanistan. I mean, certainly it does have recruits from Afghanistan and Pakistan and in the region, but, you know, it's not a locally grounded militant group like the Taliban is. But it has no logical partners because ISIS is a rival of Al-Qaeda's, and most of the militant groups present in Afghanistan, including the Taliban, are very close to Al-Qaeda. So that limits it. And also the fact that, you know, it's a Salafist terror group that's surrounded by Deobandi terror groups. And, you know, ISIS basically thinks that anyone that's not a Salafist is heretical and deserves to be killed. So that's not good for its operational partnership prospects either. But it's resilient, and that's the thing that's scary about ISIS in Afghanistan. It's been hit hard for 5-6 years. You know, you've had these withering airstrikes from U.S. NATO forces, Afghan Air Force. You know, the U.S. used its mother of all bombs a few years ago against that hideout, that ISIS hideout in Jalalabad in the east. It didn't make the group go away. So it's resilient, and indeed it has been stepping up its attacks. It definitely wants to play a spoiler role in the peace process. And what's interesting is that for a long time, the ISIS would always happily claim responsibility for any of its attacks. But in recent months, we've started to see a lot of attacks in, you know, major cities, including Kabul, that have been carried out and have all the hallmarks of ISIS, just because, you know, they target Shias, or they, you know, they're very sophisticated, well orchestrated, but ISIS does not claim them. And I'm quite sure that those unclaimed attacks are carried out by ISIS. And the reason that it doesn't claim them is that it knows that if you have an attack that goes unclaimed, the Afghan government can basically blame the Taliban, just because it does that sometimes. And if it blames the Taliban, or if others blame it on the Taliban, that risks undercutting a fragile peace process. So ISIS can be a spoiler in that regard as well. ISIS would benefit, I think, from the peace process, especially if it succeeds, because I think that you know, there are factions of the Taliban that don't support the peace process. I mean, certain factions, you know, battlefield commanders, the harder line components of the Taliban, you know, they certainly have a good chance of jumping ship and joining ISIS. And I think the chances of that increase even more if there's an actual peace deal, which is a huge if. But if there is a peace deal, then I think you could have even more factions of the Taliban that oppose peace jumping ship and joining ISIS. So yeah, it certainly is a group to be very worried about. And naturally, there are always these conspiracy theories from around the region that it seems like there's always one country that's being implicated as being sort of aligned with ISIS, whether that's Pakistan or India or Russia or the US for that matter. But I think that ISIS is working independently. Certainly it forms some small operational partnerships with small militant groups, particularly splinter groups associated with the bigger groups, but it's basically doing things on its own. It has that type of capacity.
Thank you so much. And no, we are running out of short of time actually. And last two questions probably, and one is from Pallavi and last is from mine, which I will bring back to the developments within Afghanistan, political developments, because we haven't focused on that particularly. So the first question from Pallavi, that is, with Al-Qaeda not as strong as it was post 9/11, especially in Afghanistan, does Taliban supporting it can go on if the other option is not supporting Al-Qaeda and getting US troops to completing out of the country? So
yeah, that's a great question. Indeed, I mean, you would think that given that the Taliban has consistently said that it wants US troops out, that it would make a lot of sense for it, both tactically and strategically, to sever ties with Al-Qaeda. But you know, I think that this is a partnership that dies hard, right? I mean, the Taliban has, in the past, when under pressure from the US and others, refused to sever ties with Al-Qaeda. And of course, most famously in October 2001, when the US was threatening to bomb it if it didn't give up bin Laden and other senior Al-Qaeda leaders, and the Taliban did not budge. And I think that there's ideological bonds, there's family, tribal bonds, there's all types of bonds that I think make it very unlikely that the Taliban would actually give up on Al-Qaeda. Which again it's hard to believe because as you noted in your question, Al-Qaeda it's a shadow of its former self. It's not what it used to be. So why not just let it go? And the Taliban doesn't need Al-Qaeda's help. It doesn't need Al-Qaeda's tactical help in ways that it did some years ago. It's self-sufficient financially. It certainly is self-sufficient in terms of weaponry and resources. It's more like Al-Qaeda can benefit from the Taliban, not the other way around. But based on what I understand, and I don't study the Taliban's relationship with Al-Qaeda as closely as others do, but those that do study it very closely basically say, no, it's not going to happen. They're not going to give up Al-Qaeda. They have their word that they've given to it, and it's basically not going to happen. But indeed, to the extent that they continue to avoid relinquishing those ties to Al-Qaeda, raises the likelihood that the U.S. will keep some troops there. The Taliban may hope that it can use plausible deniability by, I don't know how that would work, but there's been plenty of reporting, the UN and others, that have made it quite clear that there's been meetings between the two sides. And so it seems like a case of the Taliban shooting itself in the foot by doing this, but I don't think it's going to give Al-Qaeda up.
And that brings me to the last question of the session, and it is more about the internal developments in the Afghanistan. So to make it easier, I just tried to categorize into three different. One is people like Dostum or Amrullah Saleh. Dostum recently visited India, and Amrullah Saleh, as your statement, that is close to India as well. Whereas Hikmatyar visited Pakistan recently. So that was an interesting visit. And there are people like Abdullah who visited Pakistan as well as India, and also Karzai trying to maintain the balance, Karzai and Ghani. So this is three different categories which are there right now in the political spectrum of Afghanistan. So how do you see how they're going to get along together as the peace process go ahead, and will they come together once the finalization of peace agreement in the future, or it will continue to be like this and maybe we see more instability in the political or more political chaos in Afghanistan?
Well, no, I think one of the many obstacles to the peace process is indeed the fact that you don't have any semblance of a common front within the Afghan political class. I mean, we know about the much ballyhooed rivalry between Ghani and Abdullah, but it goes deeper than that. You've got a lot of these powerful, very large egos that all command their own types of constituencies, and all of them are able to mobilize heavily armed folks very quickly if there's a dispute. And you know, they all say that they're behind the peace process, but you know, they may have different expectations, different ways of wanting to go about that. You know, there are plenty of observers that believe that Ghani is actually not supportive of the current peace process because of fear that he could lose power, because the peace process progresses to a certain point, the Taliban could demand an interim government to move the process along. So I think that is a potential problem. And even if the peace process even if you do have a common front within all of these key political stakeholders, what happens when they get to the negotiations about a power sharing deal? You know, we talk so much about how to get agreement between the Taliban and the current government, but what about the all of these powerful players that oppose the Taliban, that would all want to have some degree of power and a power sharing agreement? It's going to be very hard to work that all out, and ultimately there'll be some folks that are disgruntled. So yeah, I think it's tough, but it is a good thing that these folks are all making these visits to different countries. And I think with Pakistan, Pakistan wants to show that it's only not, it wants to support all players, all factions, that it doesn't only want to identify with, say, Ghani for that reason. But I think it's also a way of hedging. And for India too. I mean, the idea is that no one really knows what's going to happen in Afghanistan. And so it's important to try to maintain good relations with as many key political stakeholders as possible. And for the Pakistanis and others, that includes ensuring good ties with the Taliban, which goes back to what I said in the India case, that I think that there is sort of some thinking now in New Delhi that maybe it's time for India to start exploring the idea of outreach to the Taliban to make those types of contacts.
Thank you so much, Michael. And actually, as I earlier said, I'm following your work since long time. I think this is the first time we're interacting on this platform, and it is my pleasure to interact with you and know all these developments. And thank you so much for sparing time. And thank you, Pallavi. Over to you.
Thank you, Shreyas. Michael, I know we gave you a title which is trying to decode, and I think it was just a way to understand actually what happens in this region, because it was not trying to get an answer. And I think that's what we were trying to do here when you were speaking, is trying to make everyone understand the complexity of this region, because it's very, very complex. And, you know, it just can't just be, oh, this is it and this is the answer. I think that's the dynamics of Afghanistan. So thank you so much, Michael. I know it's really late in the night, and thank you so much for staying awake and joining us. So thank you again. Thank you, Shreyas, for moderating this session. When we decided this session, I said, Shreyas, you're moderating because you know this region much better than a lot of others. So thank you, Shreyas. And thank you everyone for participating. I have put in the link for the next session, which is on the global nuclear order, the current state of it. So see you next Saturday, and have a good weekend, and have a good weekend to you, Michael, and a good night to you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. This was wonderful. And thank you, Shreyas, for wonderful moderation. I follow your work as well, and I enjoy it. And I wish you all the best. Have a good weekend, and please, everyone, stay healthy.
Take care, everyone. That's right. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.